The pipe had gone cold an hour before I noticed. I was sitting outside the lodge, on the flat stone she used to scrub her hands on after grinding corn, and I was holding the pipe the way a man holds something he does not know what else to do with. The bowl had gone dark. The smoke was gone. The morning was gray at the edges and getting lighter, and I had not moved since before the light came at all. That was how the day started. Her name was Chayton's mother, the way the children called her, and Hawk who sits still, the way the old men called her, because she would go so quiet in council that men forgot she was there. And then she would say one thing that cut through everything, and no one forgot after that. I called her by her birth name, Witch Happy Star. I called her that when no one could hear. A man keeps certain things private, that is one of them. She would have been 40 years old today. I did not need to count it. She had counted it herself 2 winters ago, standing in the river to her knees and laughing at the cold. She said, "I'm almost 40 and I can still feel my feet." That was a good thing to her. I didn't understand it then. I do now. When you are close to losing something, you start noticing the proof that it is still there. 40, she never got there. I sat on her stone and held the cold pipe, and the light came up slow over the eastern ridge the way it does in October, yellow and thin, and without warmth. My youngest daughter had put food inside the lodge for me. I had heard her do it before dawn, moving quietly, the way the children moved around me now, carefully, the way you move around a horse that has been hurt and might go either way. I did not eat the food. I did not go inside. The stone was cold through my leggings, but I did not move from it. There are days that belong to the dead. This was hers. I have been chief of this band for 19 years. Before that, I was a war leader, and before that, I was a young man who thought the world was arranged for his benefit. I was wrong about that, the way young men are usually wrong about the things they are most certain of. My father gave me my adult name when I was 17, after a hunt that did not go the way I planned but ended well anyway. He said, "You are stubborn the way a river is stubborn. You go where you are going, you don't go around." He meant it as a warning. I took it as a compliment. He shook his head at that. He was a wise man. I learned to lead the way most men learn things that matter, by doing it wrong first, and then by the cost of that, and then by doing it differently. I lost men. I made decisions in winter that I was not sure of, and I found out in spring whether they were right. Some of them were. Some of them were not. A chief carries both kinds. Witch Happy came to me when I was 23, through a formal arrangement between our fathers, which is how it was done. I want to be honest. I was not looking at her the way a man looks at a woman who will change his life. I was looking at her the way a young chief looks at everything, as something to be managed, accounted for, placed correctly. She knew it. She could read a man's face the way a tracker reads ground. She didn't say anything about it then. She waited. That is the thing about her that I understood last, which means I understood it too late. She was always ahead of me, not running, just ahead, standing still, waiting for me to arrive. The first year of our marriage I was away more than I was home. There were raids from the south, disputes with the agency, a drought that made everyone mean and desperate. When I came back she was there, and the lodge was in order, and my youngest brother, who had been sick, was better because she had spent 3 weeks forcing him to drink willowbark tea every few hours, and had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch the whole time. She told me none of this. I found out from my mother. Witch Happy had told my mother not to tell me, because she did not want me distracted while I was dealing with the agency men. I asked her why when I found out. She said, "You had enough to carry." I did not know what to do with that. I was 24 years old and I had been carrying things alone my whole life because that is what a leader does. And here was this woman, this quiet, river-still woman, carrying part of it without being asked and without wanting credit. I sat with that for 3 days. On the 4th day I came to her and I said, "I see you." She looked at me a long time. Then she said, "I know, I've been waiting." That was the first time I understood I was behind. I never fully caught up, but I got closer year by year. That is most of what a marriage is, I think, getting closer to someone, not all the way, but closer. You are two different people and you stay different people, but the distance between you can shorten until it is small enough to hold in your hand. When she died, the distance came back. It came back all at once and it was not small. I heard the woman before I saw her. It was mid-morning. I had finally set the pipe down on the stone beside me and was looking at the ridge, at the thin yellow light that had not warmed since sunrise. I heard a horse on the path that comes up from the eastern camp, a steady, unhurried walk, not trying to be quiet, not in a hurry. Then the horse stopped and I heard someone get down and I heard boots on hard ground. I did not look. I heard her stop a distance away, close enough to speak, far enough to say, "I know you did not invite this." She said, "Chief Standing Stone." I said nothing. That is also a way of answering. She said, "I'm sorry to come today. I wasn't sure whether to come or not. I decided I had rather come and be wrong than not come and be wrong in the other direction." I looked at her then. She was maybe 35, no younger than that. A white woman, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had been repaired in 2 places with different thread. Brown hair pulled back plain. She had the look of a woman who had been through something, not beaten down by it, but shaped by it, the way wood is shaped by water over a long time. Her face was still. She was not afraid of the quiet. I said, "What is it you want?" She said, "I brought food. I was told you hadn't eaten." I said, "Who told you?" She said, "Your daughter, the young one. She came to me this morning before light. She said she didn't know what else to do." I thought about my youngest daughter, 15 years old and still figuring out how the world worked. I thought about her moving quietly in the dark, putting food in the lodge, and then going to find a woman she barely knew because she was worried about her father and didn't know how to say it to his face. Children see things. I said, "Set the food down and go." She set the basket down. She did not go. I looked at her. She said, "I lost my husband 14 months ago. He died in March of last year, of a fever that started in his chest and didn't stop. I sat with him for 11 days, and on the 12th day he was gone. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you know I'm not standing here ignorant of what day this is." I said, "You don't know what day this is." She said, "Your daughter told me that too. She said it was her mother's birthday. That her mother would have been 40. The ridge was very quiet. A hawk went over, not hurrying. I said, "Your husband, his name?" She said, Daniel Marsh. He had a farm east of the Sutherland Creek crossing. You probably never knew him." I said, "I knew the farm. The man who kept 2 mules and wouldn't trade them for any price." She said, something shifting in her face, "He loved those mules. Said they were the most honest creatures he'd ever worked with." I said, "He was right about that." She stood there. I sat on the stone. The morning went on being cold. After a while I said, "Sit down if you're going to stand there." She looked around. There was no other stone. She sat down in the dirt a few feet from me, pulled her coat around her and did not say anything. She had no trouble not talking. That was the first thing I noticed that was worth noticing. We stayed like that for a long time. I am not certain how long. The sun moved. The hawk came back, or a different one did. My youngest daughter came to the door of the lodge twice and looked out, and both times went back inside without saying anything, which meant she was watching and had decided to leave it alone. The woman, she told me her name later, Eleanor Marsh, Ellie, she said. If that was all right, she did not try to fill the quiet. She did not offer comfort. She did not say things about loss and time and healing that people say when they are uncomfortable with grief and want it to be over. She just sat there in the dirt in her repaired coat and breathed the cold air and let the day be what it was. That is rarer than people think. After a long time I said, she liked mornings. Alina Marsh said, did she? I said she would get up before the children, before me. In summer she would go to the creek and sit by it. She said it was the only time the world was still enough to hear properly. I asked her once what she was listening for. She said she didn't know. She said that was the point. Alina Marsh did not say anything to that. She just listened to it, the way you listen to something that deserves to be listened to and not immediately answered. I said in winter she would sit by the fire, small fire just for light. She would mend things or bead things, but I think mostly she was just sitting. When the children got up she was already settled, the way a stone is settled in the ground. She had already been wherever she needed to go in her head, and she was back, and the day could start. Alina Marsh said, she sounds like she was very steady. I said she was the steadiest thing I ever knew. I had not said that out loud before. I had thought it, the way you think things in the dark that you don't say in the light, but I had not said it. It came out of my mouth on that woman's birthday, on that cold morning, and it sat in the air between me and a white widow I had known for approximately 2 hours, and I did not take it back. Alina Marsh said quietly, I'm glad you had her. I said 14 years. She said, that's not nothing. I said, no, it is not nothing. The hawk was back. I watched it for a while, then I said, your husband, 14 months. She said, yes. I said, what do you do with it? She was quiet a moment. Then she said, I get up. I do the work the farm needs. At night I am tired enough to sleep mostly, some nights not. I talk to him sometimes, which I know is not, I know he can't hear, but it helps me think. I said I talk to her. She looked at me, not startled, not trying to manage the expression on her face. I said not out loud, in here. I tell her things that happen. I told her about the first snow this year. She always wanted to be the first one to see it. Alina Marsh said, very quietly, was she? I said, the last 3 years she was. She had the children wake her. Something moved in Alina Marsh's face. Not pity, something else. Something that recognized the thing I had said and did not try to make it smaller. She said, she sounded like she was paying attention. I said to everything, to all of it. She did not waste any of it. The food she had brought was bread and salt pork and something sweet wrapped in cloth. My daughter had taken the basket inside at some point. I had not seen her do it. The morning had gone to afternoon. Alina Marsh had stood up at some point and stretched her back and then sat back down, this time on a low rock closer to the lodge wall. I had not told her to do that. She had just done it, the way a person does a thing when they have been somewhere long enough to be somewhat at home there. I said, you have children. She said, a boy, 8 years old. He's with the Harker family today. They were good enough to take him for the day. I said, he knows his father is gone. She said, he knew it before I did, I think. He stopped setting a place for Daniel at table before I thought to. Then one night he said it again, and I asked him why, and he said he thought we should still set it for a while. So we did. For 6 months we set a place for Daniel at every meal. I looked at her. She said James decided when to stop. He came to me one morning and said, I think Papa is settled now, Mama. I think he doesn't need the place anymore. So we stopped. I said, he is 8. She said, he is 8, and he figured out something that took me considerably longer. I said, what did he figure out? She said, that you can let someone go somewhere and still keep them. I sat with that. I said, how old are you? She said, 36 in February. I said, and you are farming the Sutherland Creek place alone. She said, I have a hired man, Tomas. He's been with us 3 years. He's honest and he does the work right. And James does more than a boy should have to, and I do the rest. I said, why? She said, because it's mine. Because Daniel built it and I'm not going to let it go because it's hard. There was something in the way she said it, not defiant, not trying to convince me or herself. Just stating a fact the way you state the weight of a stone. It is this heavy. That is what it is. I said, your people thought you should sell. She looked at me. A small thing happened at the corner of her mouth. She said, my brother came out from Ohio in the spring and spent 2 weeks telling me that a woman alone shouldn't try to hold a farm, that James needed to grow up in a proper town, that I was being stubborn was the word he used. He said it like it was a disease. I said, what did you say? She said, I thanked him for coming and I told him the farm was not for sale, and I put him on the eastbound stage myself. I said he went. She said he went. He sends letters. They mostly say the same things the visit said. I said, and you write back. She said, I write back that the farm is still not for sale and James is growing up fine, and I hope he and his wife are well. I looked at her for a moment, then I said, my wife would have liked you. Eleanor Marsh went still. I said, she had no patience for people who said what they didn't mean. She said the truth is shorter mostly. She would have liked the way you said what you said about your brother. Eleanor Marsh said carefully, that is, I am glad of that. I said, she would also have asked you to stay for the evening meal. She believed in feeding people. She thought it was the most honest thing you could do for someone. Set food in front of them. Eleanor Marsh said, I don't want to intrude. I said, you are already here. You have been here most of the day. If you were going to intrude, you would have done it earlier. Something changed in her face. Not a smile, something quieter than that. She said, then I'll stay. My daughter cooked that evening. She was 15 and she knew what she was doing. Witch Happy had taught her the same way Witch Happy did everything, without making a lesson of it, just doing it alongside her until the girl's hands knew. When the food was ready, my daughter brought it out and set it between us and went back inside. She did not say anything. She was doing what her mother would have done, which is to say she was doing the necessary thing without making a ceremony of it. Eleanor Marsh said, your daughter is remarkable. I said, she is her mother's daughter. We ate. The fire was small, just enough. The night came on fast the way it does in October, dark before you expect it, the stars early and hard and bright. Eleanor Marsh said, can I ask you something? I said, you can ask. She said, you've been sitting out here all day, in the cold, alone, and you didn't eat until now. Is this how you do this day, or is this the first one? I said, the second one. She said, was the first one like this? I said, last year I rode out before dawn and I did not come back until the next morning. I rode the whole day and night. My horse got tired before I did. She was quiet. I said I did not know what else to do with it last year. I did not know where to put it, so I moved. She said, and this year you sat still. I said my daughter asked me to stay close. She did not say it directly. She left food outside my door before I woke up. That was what she said. Eleanor Marsh said she was afraid. I said she is 15 and she lost her mother and she is afraid of losing more. She should not have to be afraid of that. Not about me. Eleanor Marsh said, you can't always. I said, I know what I can and can't do. I am telling you what she is carrying, not what I can fix. I can't fix it. I can just not make it worse. She said, by staying. I said, by staying. She looked at the fire. The night was very quiet, somewhere north of Coyote, then nothing. She said, after Daniel died I didn't sleep for almost 2 weeks. Not real sleep. I would lie down and close my eyes and the dark behind my eyes was, I don't know how to say it. It was very loud. The silence was loud. And then James would come in and lie down next to me. He was 7 and he would just be there. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to help. He was just there, and after a while I would actually sleep. I said, he saved you. She said after a moment, yes, I suppose he did. I said, children do that. She said, has yours? I said, my youngest. She checks on me. She has the same eyes. Same shape, same, she watches the way her mother watched. I will be doing something ordinary, and I will look up and she is watching me with her mother's eyes and it. I stopped. Eleanor Marsh did not say anything. She waited. I said, it is not a bad thing. I want to be clear about that. It is not a bad thing. She said, I understand. I said, it just hits. She said, yes. The fire popped, a log shifted. I added another piece, and the flame came up yellow and lit her face briefly, and she was looking at the fire with an expression I recognized. Not grief exactly, not sadness exactly, the particular look of a person who is holding something very carefully so it doesn't spill. I said, you held your husband for 11 days. She said, yes. I said, you did not leave. She said, no. I said, some people would have, not out of cruelty, just they cannot bear it. She said, I know, I don't blame them, everyone does what they can. I said, you stayed. She said, I stayed. He knew I was there. At the end he wasn't really, but I believe he knew. I said, he knew. She looked at me. I said, I was there when my wife died. She knew. It is the last thing they know, that you are there. Eleanor Marsh's face did not crumple. It went very still, and she pressed her lips together once, and then she breathed out slow and she said, thank you for saying that. I said, it is not comfort, it is true. She said, I know, that's why it helps. She left when the fire had burned down to coals. She stood up and shook the cold out of her coat and picked up the basket my daughter had returned. She said, thank you for letting me stay. I said, you did not ask permission. She said, no, I didn't. I'm sorry if that was. I said, I am not complaining about it. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, I'll go. I need to get James from the Harkers before it gets too late. I said, how far is the Sutherland Creek farm from here? She said, about 2 hours if I go straight. I said, my cousin's family is half an hour east. He will give you and the boy a bed for the night if I send word. It is too late to go 2 hours alone. She looked at me. She said, you don't have to do that. I said, I am aware. Do you want the bed or not? She said, yes, thank you. I went inside and wrote a short thing on a piece of paper and gave it to my daughter with instructions. My daughter took the paper and looked at me and then at the woman standing outside and then back at me, and she went. She did not make a face about it. She was her mother's daughter. Eleanor Marsh said from outside, I'll come back. If that's, I'll come back and get the basket back from your daughter, the one I left the bread in. Next week, if that's all right. I said, that is all right. She said, and I'll bring more bread. I said, you don't need a reason to come back. She went still. I said, if you want to come back, you can come back. You don't need the basket as a reason. It is not, you are not a problem to solve or an obligation. You can come back. She stood there in the dark outside the firelight, and she looked at me for a long time. She said, all right. I said, go get your boy. She went. I sat by the coals for a long time after. I thought about Witch Happy. I do that most nights, I will not pretend otherwise. I thought about her sitting by the small fire in the morning before the children woke, that stillness she carried, the way she had found the quiet place inside herself and could go there while she was also right here, also present, also completely available the moment she was needed. I had never been able to do that. I was always either here or there. She was always both. I thought about what she would have said about today. I knew what she would have said. She would have said almost nothing. She would have sat with me the same way she always sat with me when I was carrying something, near enough to feel, far enough to let me breathe. And eventually she would have said one thing. She would have found the one thing that was true, and she would have said it plainly, and then she would have gone back to being quiet. I thought about what the one thing might have been. I thought about Eleanor Marsh sitting in the dirt in her repaired coat, not trying to fix anything, not saying the right words, just staying, being there, breathing the same cold air, letting the day be what it was. I thought she has some of that particular kind of steadiness. It is not the same thing. It is a different thing that looks similar from the outside. Witch Happy's stillness came from somewhere very deep and very old. Eleanor Marsh's steadiness. The look of it was harder, newer, like something that had been built recently out of necessity and hadn't quite been tested, yet in all the ways it needed to be tested. But the bones of it were right. I thought Witch Happy would have liked her. I had said that to Eleanor Marsh and I meant it, but sitting there by the coals I thought about it more specifically. Witch Happy had been wary of women who needed to be liked. She had no patience for performance. She could hear it immediately, the slight thinness in the voice when someone was saying what they thought you wanted to hear rather than what they actually thought. Eleanor Marsh did not do that. Everything she said all day had the same texture, plain, weighted, meant. When she said something, it was the thing she meant. When she didn't say something, it was because she had decided it was better unsaid, not because she couldn't find the right presentation of it. Witch Happy would have recognized that. She would have recognized it and she would have said nothing about it directly because that was her way, and eventually after 2 or 3 visits she would have done something, made some small gesture, offered something, included Eleanor Marsh in something small and domestic and offhand, and that would have been her saying, "You are welcome here." She didn't use words for the things that mattered most. She used the gesture, the action, the being here. I sat by the coals and I thought, I am 61 years old. I thought she would have been 40 today. I thought I sat on her stone all day and I talked to a woman I barely knew, and I said things out loud that I had not said to anyone, and I ate food, and I sat by a fire, and none of that is nothing. My daughter came back from my cousin's. She came inside without saying anything, and she moved around the lodge doing small things, putting things right, and then she came and sat near me by the coals. I said, "Thank you for this morning." She said, "I didn't do anything." I said, "You did." She was quiet, then she said she was nice, the widow. I said she was. My daughter said, "Mama would have liked her." I looked at my daughter, her face, her mother's eyes. I said, "I know." She said, "I thought she would. That's why I went to her this morning. I thought I didn't know what to do." And I thought, what would Mama do? And then I thought maybe she would find someone steady and just send them. I said, that is exactly what she would have done. My daughter looked at the coals. She said, "Do you think the widow will come back?" I said she said she would. She said, "Do you want her to?" I thought about that. I thought about Eleanor Marsh sitting in the dirt, not talking, letting the day be what it was. I thought about how she had said, "You can let someone go somewhere and still keep them." I thought about her boy stopping dinner service for his dead father and then starting it again because he had decided the man needed the place still, and then stopping it again when he decided the man was settled. 8 years old. I said, yes, I would like her to come back. My daughter looked at me, her mother's eyes, and she did not smile exactly, but something happened in her face that was in the neighborhood of it. She said, "Good." She got up and went to her bed. I sat by the dying coals. The lodge was warm. Outside the stars were doing what stars do in October, cold and indifferent and very beautiful. I said, "The way I say things I do not say out loud. Today was your day. I sat on your stone. I talked about you. A woman came and she let it be your day and she did not try to make it anything else. She just stayed." I said, 40, you should have had 40. I said, "I am going to live the rest of this out, Witch Happy. I am not done. I told you I wasn't done and I am not. The children need me here and I am here. I am going to be here." The coals went red and dim. I said, "She is steady. I don't know yet what it is, but she is steady." I stopped there because there are things you don't say even to the dead. Not yet. Things that need more time and more knowing before they have the right shape to be said. I put the last small piece of wood on the coals. I sat with it. Outside, the stars. Witch Happy's favorite season for stars. She said October had the best ones because the air was clean and cold and there was nothing between you and them. I sat there until the fire was warm, and the stars were as bright as she always said they were.